Hello. So, I'm so excited to see all of you here. So what we'd like to do to maximize the time that we have available to us is sort of keep getting your lunch. We're going to start the talk so that we don't run out of time. There is a class here at 1:15, so we will have a hard stop at 1, and I know a lot of you need to get to class. If you have your stuff on a chair and nobody's actually sitting on it, please put your hand up so somebody can find a seat. I think we're going to run out of seats. My name's Jocelyn. I'm the director of the library. I'm really excited to see you all here for Banned Books Week. This is a week where we really try to explore issues around censorship, and the role that a library has in Banned Books Week and censorship really revolves around the fact that we stand sort of at the center of the distribution of information and the creation of knowledge, right? And so libraries have a very personal and vested interest in ensuring that people have access to all kinds of information, not just certain kinds of information. We'll talk more about that tomorrow and on Thursday as we move through our Banned Books Week events. I want to turn it over to Josh Smith, who is fundamental in bringing our speakers onto campus this week, and he'll introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, and thanks very much to the library. This is very much has its origin in the library and is sustained by the library. This talk is also, before I get going, co-sponsored by the HLS or ACLU at HLS, the Harvard Law Rule of Law Society, the Law and Philosophy Society, and the Federalist Society. So for many of us, art is not instrumental. It's not means to something else. It is an endpoint in itself. And this is, I think, part because its beauty, its ambiguity, its vagueness at times, its contradictions, its paradoxes say things that can't be said any other way, and they bring us places out of the often vulgar and crude drudgery of daily life. So I'm very excited to be talking or to be presenting Svetlana Mencheva, who is the Director of Programs for the National Coalition Against Censorship. She is a literary scholar and a public commentator as well. And she is going to help us confront the threat that moral propagandists of all ideological stripes pose to the arts. Banned Books Week is also a more national event as well. It is run in part by the organization that Svetlana is from, the National Coalition Against Censorship, as well as other free speech organizations like Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, the American Booksellers for Free Expression, the American Library Association. So I invite you to listen critically to Svetlana. I invite you to ask her questions afterward. And without further ado, Svetlana.
Is this working? Oh, yes. So thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you, Josh, so much for having me here. And I really want to have a conversation with you, but I have to also do my talk. So I will try to make this concise because I think there's so many things that we want to say on this topic. So a little bit of history. I've been with the National Coalition Against Censorship for a very long time, since the beginning of the century, and I've seen a lot of changes. And NCAC itself has been around since 1973, and 1973 was the year of Miller versus California, when obscenity law kind of was constrained, and it included community standards. And obscenity law is going to play a little role in this, especially the patently offensive clause of it. So I'm mentioning it. But the change I've been witnessing has brought us to this point where we have something new going on. And I have to say that NCAC does not litigate. We do mostly policy. We educate. We talk to public officials. We also talk to private institutions, trying to have an open environment for free speech. And litigation in that case is, it's long, it's costly, it doesn't restore the work when it should be restored. So policy work, and I assume you're all law related, but policy work is really, really important. Especially today, when we have culture very much happening within private institutions. Publishers, art museums, they're all mostly private. So what's unique about today? We have this, what's referred by some people as a crisis of free speech. And the crisis of free speech, of course, is not about the lack of speech. In a way, we have more speech than ever. We're drowning in speech online. But what is going on is a kind of fundamental questioning of the commitment to the principle of free speech, to protecting all kinds of speech and to keeping cultural platforms open to a variety of positions, even positions you don't like. And that questioning is coming from a constituency that has traditionally been the constituency most in favor of free speech, the liberal left. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, but I want to first put it in perspective. I'm talking a new development. There are also older issues which have to do with government pressures, private pressures on speech, censorship as we understand it, as a confrontation between the state and the individual, and that is going on. My organization is dealing with cancellations of drag queen story hour in libraries across the country. This is an event where drag queens read tales, like just stories, to young kids. And people bring their kids voluntarily. However, we've had threats of violence against libraries calling for the cancellation of drag queen story hour. We have challenges to books in schools on a weekly basis. I can talk about it endlessly. We have challenges to political art, criticizing the president. We have one of the latest development is government pressure on Middle East programs to take a particular ideological viewpoint. We have delegitimizing the press, surveillance, refusing First Amendment rights to prisoners. And then, of course, we have the online social media cartels controlling information. So this I fully admit, this is the general problem, the big environment. But within the world of culture and academia, where we live, the left, for my friends, are proposing a vote of no confidence for free speech. And that is to me a problem, because these are our supporters and these are my friends. Hannah Black, an artist who became well-known around a controversial address later at the Whitney, who is a Black identified British artist, she said in an article recently in Freeze magazine, "When we talk about free speech, it already feels like we're ceding ground to the right." So there's this total position of free speech is contaminated as a principle. And the argument goes, the marketplace of ideas is rigged. Until we fix the system and have equality for all and in all aspects, and until rights fully extend to everybody, the right to free speech profits the socially privileged unfairly and further oppresses the victims. And then it does damage to the vulnerable by perpetuating systemic injustice. And worse, free speech could lead to violence and is connected closely to violence. Of course, we have 8chan and we have the El Paso Manifesto that reinforces that connection. And it doesn't help the cause that neo-Nazis are marching under the banner of free speech. So we have a problem. A very concise way that the position is summarized is in a recent article by Nasreen Malik in The Guardian, who says, "The purpose of free speech crisis myth is to guilt people into giving up the right to respond to attacks and to destigmatize racism and prejudice. It aims to blackmail good people into ceding space to bad ideas, even though they have a legitimate right to refuse. And it is a myth that demands, in turn, its own silencing and undermining of individual freedom." So what's in here? The first point is the right to response. And I think the right of response is something we need to defend. The right to protest, the right to call for cancellations, the right to protest certain art and protest the Sacklers funding. The right to protest is something that free speech protects. And we need visibility to those issues. And Professor Kennedy was asking, well, just before the speech, isn't cancel culture a type of speech? Yes, it is. Calls for cancellations are. To me, the problem becomes when you have the response of the institution. So you can protest or want to question free speech. How institutions respond And what happens to the culture at large is what concerns me here. And there we lead to the question of space and deplatforming. So what should cultural institutions give space to? Most calls for regulation do not demand state regulation, because the state is not a friend to the left. They target cultural institutions to deplatform speakers, remove art, and cancel performances. And the argument is that certain voices should not be heard. Steve Bannon should not appear at the New Yorker festival because it legitimizes them, and it also spreads dangerous ideas. So, but this is not only about Steve Bannon, it's not only about neo-Nazis, it comes, and this is what I'm going to talk about, it comes down to artists who are potential allies and who have the best of intentions, but somehow they have overstepped by using others' histories. And this is what I'll talk about, and I think it's relevant to the bigger question because it brings the issue of where do we draw the line. And today, accusations of offense, of trauma, of insensitivity, of cultural appropriation, of racism within the art world are, as you probably have sensed it on campus too, are a minefield. And these are labels you cannot shake off. Somebody calls you a racist, it's just very hard to argue, no, I'm not a racist. And one of the first cases, I don't know, how many of you know about the Dana Schutz controversy at the Whitney? Oof. So Last Whitney biennial, which was very much a response to police violence against black men, and this was very much in the news at that point. This was 2017. Dana Schutz, who happens to be a white artist, did this painting, which just does not reproduce well in any context, because it's sort of three-dimensional. It has a big gash in the middle. So this painting is based on the image of Emmett Till in his casket, his mutilated body, the image that really made a major difference in the civil rights movement, and the image that his mother, Mamie Till, really wanted seen. She wanted seen it, and it was very, it was mobilizing because it's really an atrocity. So Dana Schutz did this painting with the intent to bring again the attention to violence over the bodies of black men. And protests started immediately. This young man is Parker Bright, and he's an artist, and he stood in a performance the first day in front of the painting, protesting its appearance. And then Hannah Black, who I mentioned before, she publicized a letter and a petition that was very broadly circulated, saying a lot of things. Among them, the subject matter is not Schutz's. And that's key here. White free speech and white creative freedom have been founded on the constraint of others and are not natural rights. The painting must go. And like months of debate ensued. The Whitney did not remove the work. They hosted, actually they invited Claudia Rankin, who is the founder of the Institute for the Racial Imaginary, to hold a session. It was full. It was a beautiful Sunday evening, and the whole art world was there in the atrium of the Whitney. And people are still split on that issue, whether the Whitney should have shown this, whether they were exhibiting their racism by showing it, and whether it should have been removed. The calls for destruction were more muted, but they were there as well. So this stayed, but then very soon after, just a month after, there was a controversy over this installation, which was in Minneapolis. You see it as it was shown in Europe, in Kassel at Documenta. And then it was bought by the Walker Art Center and exhibited in the park that's in front of the Walker, a big public park in Minneapolis. So this is a composite of 7 gallows that are used in capital punishment, that have been used from the 19th through the 20th century in capital punishment in the US. And it went well in Germany. It's about capital punishment, and everybody's still wondering why this country, why, in the 21st century, we have capital punishment. So it's a critique of capital punishment. Sam Durant, the artist, has been very much involved in indigenous rights. He did that as a critique of the capital punishment. However, one of the gallows was a gallows used in 1862 to execute 32 Dakota in Mankato, Minnesota, very close to Minneapolis. So protests immediately started, like even before it was open. The park was still in construction, and there were protests and calls to remove the work. And that was happening over Memorial Day 2017. It was just like the controversy sprung up on Friday. By Monday, the museum decided to dismantle the work, to just destroy it, and to, with the collaboration of the artists, to cede all rights, intellectual property rights to the work to the Dakota elders. And that did not take into account that there were even disagreements within the Dakota community. It was a very quickly made decision. The artwork was dismantled and eventually given to the Dakota to do what they wanted with it, to whether burn it, bury it, and I think they spent a bunch of time figuring out what to do with it, and then sort of had a ritual of destroying it, of burying it. So both controversies were more about the identity of the artist than the content of the work. This is not your story. The same as with Dana Schutz. It's not her story. Because at the same time, together with the Dana Schutz at the Whitney, you had this painting of the murder of Philando Castile, and it was a painting by Henry Taylor, a black artist, and that was very well received. Sort of a similar topic, but the identity of the artist is different. So the question is, does a white artist have the moral right? We're not talking about First Amendment rights here, we're talking about moral rights, but institutions are beholden to moral rights. So doesn't white artists have the moral right to make artwork about a story of core importance to a racial or ethnic group to which they do not belong, or to make use of images, ideas, or characters belonging to the traditions of culturally marginalized groups? And the answer coming from people who want to remove or destroy the work are no, but only the groups that have been the victim of a particular moment can claim ownership of that moment. And others who also share a skin color with the perpetrators of violence have no right to it and only cause more pain by appropriating it. This is the saying, oh, you exploited our bodies, now you're exploiting our history. You should not be doing that. And then, of course, white artists belong to a group that is structurally still privileging itself. Therefore, racially charged work by these artists is of necessity suspect, and at worst, it perpetuates racism and oppression. So I disagree with some of the logic of those arguments, but my role here, and I think they're counterproductive to the cause of social justice, my role here is not so much to argue with them, first of all, because I have to give them more justice to be able to argue with them, and I don't want to kind of build up straw figures and battle them. But what I'm doing is outlining a specific environment because these are not just theoretical positions. These are not just arguments. They have real effects, and those effects are both on artists and art institutions. You have long-term penalties. You have the blacklisting of artists. Dana Schutz, for instance, she had a retrospective at the Institute of Contemporary Art here in Boston just after that controversy, and there were calls to cancel this entire retrospective because of this one work, even though the work was not in the retrospective. So fortunately, it went on. Then there are other artists like that are blacklisted and that were actually excluded from shows, like Vanessa Place, who's a conceptual poet who did a very controversial work on Twitter, and she's also done very different, non-controversial work, but people invite her to be in a show and then say, oh, we got protests. And she was even going to be part of the Berkeley Poetry Festival on the 50th anniversary of the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. The whole thing was canceled because of her presence. But most of concern to me are pressures upon institutions. And the question that a museum is showing something and validating it, and they should not be showing it, they should not be having this conversation, is the problem to me. And part of the Sam Durant protests were no conversation, take it down. Because very frequently we have a controversy and we say, well, let's talk about it. This is an interesting conversation to have. More and more, the call is just take it away. This hurts us. We do not want to talk about it. And the broader context is that defense is not just about artwork and it's not just about identity of artists. It's happening in publishing. This is a work that is coming out now again, but this is a young artist, a young writer who came from China. And this is a fantasy tale about an empire that enslaves magical minorities. But critics were saying that her trope, using the trope of slavery, she is erasing a specifically African-American experience, and she was roundly attacked on young adult Twitter, which is kind of like if you want to see people attacking each other, people that are on the same position, on the same page politically, but they're holding each other to a very high standard. So young adult Twitter is a kind of very kind of polices what people are writing. So she had to pull her book because she was attacked for appropriating that experience, even though she was talking about the epidemic of indentured labor in Asia and countries across Asia, and also trafficking, which is a real problem. Other artists like her, mostly minority authors, have also pulled. And these are the most vulnerable. But so there is the effect on authors. There's also the effect on the publishing infrastructure. The Kirkus Review, for instance, pulled a review of American Heart, which is a novel about the so-called white savior narrative. It's a novel about a girl who helps another girl from a Muslim refugee camp to escape to Canada. But that was the Kirkus Review was attacked. They pulled the review, and they reissued it, changed it a little bit, and took away. It was a starred review, so it was a recommended book. They took away the star, and that was as a result of public pressure over the trope of the white savior narrative. And finally, publishers themselves have pulled books, as happened with this book, which is about the story of George Washington's slave Hercules, who is it's a story of this, he's the chef. He was, like a celebrity chef. He was a great chef, and it was happily, people are happily portrayed, and it portrays slavery as a kind of, happy place. It wasn't about slavery, it's about a cook, and it's also about a children's audience. So Scholastic initially defended the book, but then pulled it out of stores and pulped it. They didn't add additional material. They just destroyed the book. And one of my friends was saying, I really got angry when I got to a bookstore and I wanted to get a copy of the book, and they said, no, we have the copies, but we're banned from selling them. We're pulping this book. And of course, it was the issue here was that the content, that slavery was not portrayed in its brutality. But of course, if you portray slavery in its brutality, Sorry about the pixelation. It's also a problem. And this was something you might have heard about. This is an ongoing controversy in San Francisco at a school called George Washington High School. And they have 16 murals painted by this Russian artist who was a communist, who was here in the early 20th century and saying, you know, George Washington is always a hero. I have to portray the bad parts of his legacy, i.e., he had slaves. And he was also, you know, and this is the Westward Expansion, and the Westward Expansion is on the backs of dead Indians. But that mural was controversial in the 60s. And another, an African-American artist from San Francisco was commissioned and did a work about diversity and people of color and how they did in this country. But that was not enough. It was very controversial now, and there were calls for its destruction. And early on, I think in this summer, the Board of Ed decided to destroy it. And the arguments here are interesting. It is about offense. Because on the one hand, people are saying, well, this is educational. This educates about the dark side of the legacy of one of our national heroes. But one of the Board of Education former members is saying, I don't understand how people who are not affected by the depiction of a mural could come in here and tell us how Native Americans and Indians should see the mural and what's on there, when Native Americans came here and told us it was offensive. And this is the kind of the master of this word of offense. You know, you can't argue with it. It's emotional. That was the same with the Sam Durant's work with the scaffold. I had a BBC conversation with one of the Native American activists, and she started talking about her pain. And it's very hard to make a logical argument against somebody who is saying they saw this work and they started crying. But should you make decisions about destruction based on those, on the basis of those arguments? So the school went through the whole process. They convened a reflection and action group last year, and the reflection and action group decided the mural glorifies slavery, genocide, colonization, manifest destiny, white supremacy, oppression, and so on. It glorifies oppression instead of eliminating it. It perpetuates bias through stereotypes rather than ending bias. It's not a counter-narrative if it traumatizes students and community members. So it was decided to destroy the mural, and this summer there was huge national protests. And now they kind of pulled back a little and they say they're going to cover it with permanent panels. They're not going to entirely destroy it. And so we all agree we should remember history, and in a way that recognizes violence and oppression. But how is this ever to be done? Because if it's too dark, it's painful, it's offensive, it's traumatic, you're reminded of that every day. If it's too sunny and bright, it's misleading, this also offensive. So how do we talk? How do we reckon with history? And we've had challenges to Huck Finn, to Kill a Mockingbird, to Confederate flags that are illustrating history lessons. This is going on. How do we talk about those issues? And perhaps we have reached this crisis moment because the US has never been able to really address the issue of historical guilt. And I'm European, so I'm much more used to the historical guilt part. Or perhaps ironically, because it has never before been so truly multicultural. We actually have more voices up there speaking, even though we're noticing who is not, but there's never been a time in history that culture has been so diverse. We want more diversity, but show me when we have been better. So it's not easy to address those painful issues in a nuanced way, especially at a time of heightened political tension. And we can make arguments about intermixed history, about the complexities of speech and power, but the pressure to take a strong and unambiguous position are very, very high. And the bottom line is, do cultural institutions have the stomach and the PR power to keep risking a spot in the crossfire? And my organization has been actually, kind of to plug us a little bit, working on those issues. We did this, we interviewed curators and did a little booklet, which Josh is going to show, Smart Tactics, which is like, how do you handle this? How do you show difficult content at the same time as not kind of wading into an unproductive, can you show it? Oh, there it is, yeah. Without wading into unproductive controversy. That we cannot avoid controversy. We just have to have a good conversation and agree to disagree. And we're sort of not used to that. We want to resolve issues. But maybe we should stay in this position where we don't know, and we talk and we bring different positions together. But now people just can't talk to each other. So to me, like, as a free speech person, that's what I want to have. I want to have more speech. And if people are angry, let them express their anger. So again, the question, does the environment we have pose a special threat to the free circulation of ideas in culture? And I don't want to have a false narrative here about the free speech in the immediate future, though there's plenty to feed that dystopia, and cancel culture is just a minor part of it. What's happening online, what's happening with governments here and globally, it's much more the issue. But what I want to point out, that especially to you, because you're so young, is that we should not make the mistake of taking free speech as a solidly established value. The banner of free speech actually has been waving for a very short time, and this has been pretty much in post-Second World War liberal democracies. And that is the recent memory of Americans now, and probably not only you, but your parents. Before the mid-20th century, first of all, the First Amendment didn't offer much support to art and culture. Film, visual art, books, you still had obscenity laws. In the 19th century, when Anthony Comstock's New York Society for the Suppression of Vice took the task to uphold public morals, he did it very proudly. And look at the logo. The logo is, yes, we're going to put people in jail and we're going to burn books. And it was just taken for granted that we should protect the vulnerable, and the vulnerable were children, women, and the lower classes from the corrupting influence of low subject matter. So you had a very robust censorship regime, both public and private. And publishers, librarians were very much involved in that, maintaining a kind of homogeneous culture and a censorship regime and keeping those corrupting influences from the lower classes. But what happened is that free speech became our power as opposed to our political enemies. And you had the Nazi book burnings. No more of this possible because it was the Nazis now, not the good people in Boston. And you had degenerate art shows of the Nazis. The Soviet Union tortured and killed artists, theater makers, and so on. So free speech became a Cold War weapon. And in the 50s, the threat to the moral order became, very interestingly, in Ruff versus the United States. The Supreme Court kind of gave its blessing to offense as a reason to censor, because the definition of obscenity shifted from what is corrupting of the vulnerable, a very old definition dating to Britain, to what is patently offensive. So when we look at offense, it's not like invented yesterday. It has a long history, and then it kind of went from legal discourse into popular discourse, and it blossomed with the culture wars in the 90s, when the Cold War ended in 1989, and the cultural suppression was no longer seen as symbolic of the censorship was no longer symbolic of the ugly power of the Soviets and our Cold War enemy. So the culture wars that you probably don't remember were wars that started in Congress over defunding the arts. saying what artists are doing, what the National Endowment for the Arts is funding is art that is offensive to taxpayers, i.e. art dealing with sexuality, art dealing with women, and mostly the art was around AIDS, the gay movement, the feminist movement. So they wanted to pull government funding from that art because it offended taxpayers. And one of the solutions people said, well, why do we need government funding of the arts? If we don't have government funding, then the government is not going to start censoring the arts. So let's just have private funding of the arts. And of course, the private ownership of cultural institutions then exposed them to way more pressure, both from funders and from communities. And there's no First Amendment to bar a private institution from censorship. So today we have pressures coming from all sides. Funding pressures from public and private money and community pressures. And so to me, there are three distinct things that are my fears today. And one is self-censorship. And it's quite real. It is when you're fearing that somebody will take your funding, or when you're fearing that your whole show will be occluded because of a controversial artwork, you're just going to start self-censoring. And that's happening also in the publishing industry. A prominent children's book agent was quoted as saying, without revealing her name, "None of us are willing to comment publicly for fear of being targeted and labeled racist or bigoted." So you can't even have a discussion sometimes. And that is particularly dangerous in the arts because experimentation is really important. Mistakes are important. Nuance is important. So if you cannot make a mistake, if you're worried about saying something that will end you as a blacklisted artist, how can you do your work? And Coco Fusco, a Cuban-American artist, saying, if I want art that could handle more than pretty pictures and simplistic evocations of identity, I understand that I'll have to support not only difficult subjects, but clumsiness and mistakes. And that is really kind of the other fear, is that people are worried about saying the wrong thing, so they cannot experiment. And finally, of course, there are calls for regulation, both formal and informal. And I want to end with a lot more to say, but I think we're almost out of discussion time. In 1994, Bell Hooks, and it's 1994, this is how many years back, but it reads so contemporary. She criticized as disturbing and dangerous the censorship deployed as an acceptable means of social control in the Black liberation struggle and feminist movement, and she was involved in both. She's saying that the regulatory silencing of dissenting voices and opinions ultimately undermines free speech and strengthens the forces of censorship within and outside radical movements. So, wait. I have to skip ahead. So back to the question, will free speech survive? Probably, but it will be transformed as it always is. And it's already transforming with new technologies of communication. And for cultural institutions, this is a particularly challenging time. What is their role, for instance, in the national reckoning with historical guilt? What is their role in the process of building a multicultural democracy? To me, the role of those institutions is not to take up straight political advocacy, but to stay with the questions, not fear difficult questions and avoid quick resolutions. And as Kathy Holbright, who was a curator in many different museums, wonderfully phrased it, we need safe spaces for unsafe ideas. Yes. Thank you. And I'd love to hear from you. I don't know.
If you have a question, just please raise your hand and I will come along with the mic.
Or comments.
Many thanks for the talk. So you separated institutional response from kind of response of private individuals in your talk. So I'm just wondering whether there's more to cancel culture than just institutional response, because I feel like kind of a huge part of cancel culture and a lot of what stops us from speaking out, it's not just kind of the prospect of losing a job or get a book pulled from the publishing, etc., etc. But sometimes kind of being socially ostracized or being subject to shame is what kind of motivates people to self-censor. And I understand it's more difficult to police even than the response of private institutions, because of course we have freedom to associate with people that we want to associate with. So I was wondering, what main challenges do you see like in this area, in like social interactions, as like a method of censorship, and what complexities do you see in how we as a society can move forward while not infringing our privacy and our freedom to choose who to like, choose who to be friends with?
Well, that's you're talking about the impact on the individual, not so much the institutional. And I have so many individuals that, curators at museums and so on, that say they disengage from social media because once they say something that goes against the grain. And again, I think a lot of this conversation is happening on one political side. So these are your friends. And when you disagree with your friends and you become ostracized, you become also like professionally ostracized. So how do we deal with that? And that's a very hard question. I think it's partly a result of how we interact on social media, because it's short, it's open to misinterpretation. My call would be to have more in-person gatherings, and I think museums, libraries are great spaces for that, kind of pulling, because people interact very differently when they're, even if I know you and we're online and I disagree with you online, I'll just slam you and unfriendly you. If we're in a room together, I'll probably argue with you and sort of try to understand what you're saying. So the kind of, maybe the etiquette of online communication and how we engage will evolve. I hope it will evolve. But in the meantime, the online public forum is no replacement for in-person human contact. And again, I think institutions are really important, from schools to colleges to libraries and art institutions. You need that kind of more complicated in-person contact. And yeah. And I mean, people, Sam Durant, when the scaffold controversy was going on, he said he left, he's the artist, he left all social media. He just did not want, he just disengaged entirely. And I mean, it's just such a big question, because we also have, I mean, artists coming, for instance, we've been working, there's this woman, there are many artists from different cultures that present their work online, and this is their native place for presenting work, and then they get harassed. So we had a Yemeni artist who was kind of attacked from her own community, from Yemeni men that were just, she not only left online communication, she left the country. And she could not use Instagram to spread her work because of this harassment. So we're working, and Penn has been working on that. How do you respond as an artist or as an individual to online harassment? So we're developing these kind of new skills to negotiate a new environment. But we can't, there's no magic bullet. It has to be a process, and we have to be all working on it.
So with respect to the cultural institutions you mentioned, I sort of see in this problem a big principal-agent problem, whereby the directors of these institutions, even though they see the long-term interest in the institutions as supporting free expression, the personal vitriol that they're going to face for supporting that is, is much more personal. And there's no great incentive for them to act maybe in the long-term best interest of the institution in order to shield their own situation. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts as to what changes or institutional changes that can be put in place in order to realign the incentives a little better.
Well, first of all, for museums, free speech is probably not the only thing in their mission. They also have to be responsive to their communities. More and more, they have to be working towards social justice. So there's the safety issue. There was the case, I don't know whether you know about the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim had a show of art from China, historical art from China. They had threats of violence. So you have the safety of the institution to consider as well, which is for me the hardest problem. There were a million signatures under a change.org petition to remove several videos documenting performances with animals from the exhibition, and then they received threats of violence, so they removed them. So we have been working on that, kind of like protocols of how they respond, and we did this document with other art service organizations called Best Practices for Museums. So it is how you don't respond to controversy by removing the work, but you give yourself time and you have a conversation, and how you handle media. It's a multi-tiered approach, but yes, we're working with institutions to help them navigate this new environment, because it is a new environment. And we're also working with a kind of mutual support between institutions so that they can stand behind each other. An institution does not want to be left alone in the field. A museum director does not want to be the lone supporter of free speech. But again, free speech is not their one and only mission goal. So there are a lot of these personal decisions. And also, do you endanger the institution and its funding? A gentleman and then the green shirt, black shirt.
Thanks. So a few years ago, my alma mater, Brown University, hosted the former head of the New York Police Department. And while he was speaking, a lot of students jumped up and started yelling and waving signs to the point that he couldn't be heard anymore, and he just had to leave. I was wondering what people either within a community or what an organization such as yours could do to prevent situations like that from happening in the future, because that situation at Brown wasn't the only time that's happened. That's happened at other universities around the country when it comes to controversial speakers.
Well, I think actually the universities have started learning from that, and that was one of the first ones, and then there were the Charles Murray and so on. But I think universities have been better. We haven't heard so much about this kind of disruptions lately, and it's a very clear line. So the university needs to provide space for protests. People have to be able to have their voices heard if you really hate somebody who's coming as a speaker on campus. On the other hand, you cannot stop that speaker from speaking. So this is what the university needs to provide enough security to protect the ability of the speaker to speak, at the same time have a real space for those protesting the speech to be speaking as well. And in kind of my observation after the Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer and all these, and the Charles Murray controversy in different places, universities have now started developing more kind of considered process. So it's where people can speak on both sides without silencing each other. I mean, there are always people that would want to disrupt. I mean, my other friends at Antifa want to disrupt. I think that's wrong. And they'll probably try to disrupt, but that's why you have campus security. And that's the other issue, because campus security is starting to become expensive. Berkeley had to spend like $1 million or more over a potential event that featured Milo Yiannopoulos. The event kind of sputtered, but they still spent the money. So can a university afford that? that should not be a question today. I mean, it should be law enforcement should be federal, local law enforcement should be there to assure safety and security. But that becomes a problem, and there is a Berkeley task force that issued a rather disturbing statement, which sort of said, well, if it's too expensive, maybe we can't do it. And then with Drag Queen Story Hour, we had a recent city ordinance saying, well, if you're a group that could be very controversial, you have to provide your own security, which is you're putting a price on free speech. You cannot do that. But I think the issue of security and violence is going to become more and more of a problem. The threats of violence are occurring, and what do you do? Especially if you're a small institution. What if you're a small art space? What if you're not Berkeley? But that's...
I was wondering if you could say more about what you think the role of cultural institutions in protecting free speech is, because it seems like they're always going to be balancing free speech against something else. They're curating. It's not like an open forum where anyone can come and put their art on the walls. And so it seems reasonable that some of the other things that they might consider are social justice issues or representation or whatever. And so then even if in some of these circumstances, some people might say they made the wrong decision, I can't fully understand why that comes down to them like violating the principle of free speech as opposed to making a curatorial decision.
That's a great question. I think we face this, like, what is responsible editorial control and what is self-censorship, right? I think, yes, they have freedom to curate, and they can curate. When they're curating, they do take into account what their other mission is and what they want to do to the culture at large. To me, it's the censorship question rises when they're doing something under pressure. But the thing is that they're doing things under pressure not only after a show is open. And in Smart Taxes, that's why I was interviewing curators. I was asking them, so in the preparation of the show, what kind of pressures are you facing, and how are you responding to them? You as a curator can curate a show in line with the mission of the museum to do only on women or only like other underrepresented groups, for sure. But then you get external pressure to modify that or to remove a work of art because it could be read in a way that it could be read as it's like a white woman doing something. It could be read as exploitative. That's when and it's a kind of like a subtle line between editing and censorship. The issues that come in very like the public eye with the Walker, for instance. Yes, you had something that the museum had gone through the whole process, was being put up, was constructed, and then was removed with pretty much no discussion. So that's a pretty clear issue. It becomes blurrier when it is an internal process. But we've had, cancellations of plays, say, around Israel from pressure from donors, plays that are already scheduled, they're going to come out, and then they're canceled. So when it's not a curatorial decision, but comes in an external pressure, I'd say that's when the fears of censorship arise.
I should have said this in the very beginning. We have, you're welcome to speak with Svetlana afterwards. We have multiple events. We have Walt Whitman Band in Boston is an exhibition in the library entrance. Tomorrow, we have book burnings internationally, which includes an exiled Romanian political writer. And then we also have on Thursday, Professor Randy Kennedy is talking about censorship in the American slavery regime. So hope to see you at some of those. And thanks very much for coming, and feel free to come speak to Svetlana afterward.